Good morning and happy Friday. On behalf of Assistant Vice Chancellor Marquita Greno Shire and the other directors of the Educator Preparation Program at the Chancellor's Office, I, Fred Uwe, welcome and thank you for this webinar on the development of ethnic identity in educator preparation. This session features an array of leaders in this field and research area. Currently, our world is undergoing such instances of injustice, and this discussion is very timely. And your attendance and your time are precious to us, and you came here to listen to the experts. So I pass along the mic to Dr. André Branch.
Thank you so much. It is my pleasure to be with you this morning, and I want to thank all of the panelists for being here. Dr. Ellis, would you please show the slides? I am Dr. André Branch, Associate Professor at San Diego State University. And with us this morning are a number of other folks, Dr. Christine Sleeter, who is Professor Emerita at California State University, Monterey Bay. Dr. Caro Valdez, who is an Associate Professor and Department Chair at Cal State University, Fullerton. Dr. Dietrich Adelabu is a clinical professor in counseling and psychology at Boston University, Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Dr. Brandon Yu is an associate professor in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. And Dr. Antoinette Linton is associate professor and subject area coordinator for secondary science at California State University, Fullerton. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. I'd like to remind our attendees that your mics will be muted. The moderator, yours truly, will direct your questions to the panelists. And if you have questions, please take a look at the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Put your questions in that Q&A section. And at the end of all of the presentations, we will begin to field your questions. Please know that this session will be recorded. Thank you again for being with us. I want to acknowledge the recent ethnic group hate of which various Asian ethnic groups have been targets of late. We've seen numerous physical attacks on Asian ethnic groups, and I'm sure you'll agree that we should not spend 2 hours discussing ethnic identity development without acknowledging these attacks and the resulting physical pain they inflict on the immediate victims and the mental, emotional, and psychological pain inflicted on them and on all of us who care. Let us have a moment of silence. Next slide, please. So why should teachers and teacher educators concern themselves with ethnic identity development? One of the assumptions that undergirds my work is this: When individuals feel good about themselves, they don't feel the need or have the inclination to beat up on others mentally, emotionally, psychologically, or even physically. My colleagues in psychology can bear witness that the racial and ethnic braggadocio that we often hear coming from individuals claiming superiority actually betrays a deep sense of racial insecurity and low self-esteem, rather than an authentic and abiding love of oneself and one's racial and ethnic groups. We have known for a long time about the benefits of a strong sense of ethnic identity, especially for young children and adolescents. Next slide. For adolescents especially, ethnic identity serves as a buffering mechanism against attacks. It helps adolescents make informed decisions regarding connections to their ethnic groups, and it lets them know how their ethnic groups have contributed significantly to the societies in which they live. Next slide. In addition to ethnic identity being salient in popular culture, what we do know about ethnic identity and the school context is that children at all educational levels ask questions about ethnicity and ethnic identity. We know that ethnic identity is an area in which teachers are inadequately prepared. And researchers have documented positive results for African, Asian, European American, Latinx, and Native American adolescents when they have engaged in racial identity and ethnic identity exploration within the school context. Next slide. We also know that a strong sense of ethnic identity has been positively and significantly related to academic achievement, to school attitudes, to favorable social functioning, to self-esteem, and overall psychological well-being. Yet the irony is that teacher education programs, with few exceptions, do not provide instruction about ethnic identity development. And consequently, teachers are left unprepared to support students' ethnic identity exploration, a critical process that is common to the human condition. Next slide. Because I saw this chasmic gap in teacher education curricula and pedagogy, I developed the following framework of ethnic identity exploration in education. The framework shows teachers how to support students as they explore their ethnicity. It should also be used by teacher educators to provide opportunities for pre-service teachers to begin to explore their ethnicity if they haven't done so already. Because the framework has sustained student engagement, we believe that it also will be helpful to close the achievement gap. First, next slide. This first dimension communicates to parents that the school's goal is to affirm their students' ethnic identity rather than to denigrate it, deny it, or ignore it altogether. The school collaborates with parents to facilitate the ethnic identity development of their children. And now sometimes this partnership could include parents coming into the school to participate in classroom instruction, to assist teachers in promoting the ethnic identity of students. This kind of partnership is not unlike the school-home partnerships that presently exist to initiate cognitive development, social development, moral and physical development of students. Next slide. In the next dimension, teachers lead classroom discussions about ethnicity and ethnic identity, race, and related concepts so that students can explore and clarify their ethnic and racial identities. Teachers are careful to set the ground rules so that discussions will have students engage in critical thinking and analysis rather than attack their classmates. In our studies, students and teachers suggested topics for these discussions, and they've included such things as stereotyping, racism, choosing one's ethnicity, pressure to identify as one's parents identify, not being Mexican enough. This topic mushroomed to include not being Black enough, not being Asian enough, and other discriminatory measuring that goes on within ethnic groups. Next slide. In the dimension of exploration of ethnic histories, traditions, and customs, teachers guide students into learning about their ethnic heritage, and then they encourage students to use what they've learned as resources to complete required assignments and projects while learning subject matter concepts. In this process, positive ethnic content knowledge has now become a part of the curriculum. Our studies have shown that when students explore their ethnic identity, they value themselves and learning simultaneously. Next slide. In the final dimension, teachers introduce students to social justice role models within their ethnic groups. They make it their business to ensure that students meet individuals in their ethnic groups who are proud of their ethnic heritage and who work to make positive differences in society. They could be local individuals within student schools, in their neighborhoods, their cities, their states. They could be nationally renowned celebrities. The social justice role models speak out against injustice. They speak out against social inequities that affect ethnic groups disproportionately. The teachers could invite these people to share their experiences and their expertise at appropriate times during the school year. In our work, teachers have invited social justice role models to share their perspectives about the importance of fighting ethnic and racial injustice to improve the quality of life for all individuals and groups in our society. These people are not just folks who do nice things. Social justice role models challenge societal norms when necessary, and their activism helps to transform the curriculum. Next slide. Some individual teachers do this work already. Some of them are my former students. But the discipline of teacher education needs these dimensions of ethnic identity development because they represent the only framework based on research that undergirds the work of teachers supporting students in their ethnic identity development. These dimensions provide a pathway and empirical evidence to guide teacher educators as they prepare candidates for supporting the ethnic identity exploration of students in public schools. To increase their effectiveness with all students, pre-service teachers need to understand the scholastic, the psychological benefits that accrue to ethnic identity development in education. They also need to see the practice of these dimensions in their preparation programs. The time is ripe, ladies and gentlemen, for teachers being well equipped to support the ethnic identities of all of their students. Donnie is going to put a link for the study of teachers using this model in the chat now. Thank you for coming. Now I would like to introduce Christine Sleeter.
Thank you so much, André. I'm coming to you from the traditional homeland of the Esalen people and the Rumsenaloni people, who were stewards of this land for millennia and still live here. I'm going to start with a story. A teacher education program that I worked with for several years in California did, I think, a strong job of emphasizing preparation for teachers working with English language learners. Previously, I had come from a program in another state that had a strong emphasis in preparing teachers to work with African American students. And one day, I commented to a colleague in the California program that while the emphasis on English language learners is certainly needed, our program was doing absolutely zero for preparing teachers to work with African-American students and other minoritized students. And I know that many of our graduates had African-American students in their classrooms. So my colleague she sort of thought about it, and then she said, yeah, I didn't realize that. Yeah, I'm certainly not doing anything in my class. Do you have a reading or two you can recommend that we add to our syllabus? Adding bits and pieces is wholly insufficient for transforming how teachers understand and see students of diverse ethnic backgrounds, because it's not simply a matter of acquiring some information here and there, but really of reconstructing how teachers view students and communities of color. Next slide, please. This slide juxtaposes two very different perspectives about the nature of society and schools, the nature of what I'm calling here have-not groups, or groups that aren't doing all that well in society, relatively speaking, and the nature of solutions. From the dominant perspective, this would be the white supremacist perspective, groups with power perspective. We live in a fair society that's open to all who try. And this is the ideology that I grew up with in my home. It's the ideology that's taught in schools and taught in through mainstream media. It's the ideology that everybody sort of in one way or another absorbs in this country. Then you look around and you see that some groups are doing better than others. So how do you interpret that? Well, from the dominant perspective, you start drawing on the stereotypes, and we've all learned the same stock of stereotypes about lack of ability, lack of knowledge, lack of culture, lack of language, lack of family and community, etc. Then if you're a teacher, what do? Well, the solutions tend to focus on remediation and trying to fix kids who aren't succeeding in school, trying to culturally assimilate. And when people are trying to then feel positive about all of this, celebrating culture. From the perspective of minoritized groups, it's completely flipped. How do you understand the nature of schools and society in terms of being historically rigged in favor of groups with power, and particularly in favor of white people? How do you understand the nature of minoritized groups in terms of strengths, resources, with community and family being source of strength and wisdom? Then what are the kinds of solutions that we would be working towards? Dismantling the barriers of racism and building on the community and familial and cultural strengths that minoritized groups already have. Now, you can't get to you can't shift somebody's perspective if they've been steeped in the dominant white supremacist perspective with some add-ons to the curriculum. That won't transform perspective. Next slide, please. As an illustration, I want to draw from a survey that I did in New Mexico in 2015 as a part of some work I was doing as an expert witness for a court case there. I had an opportunity to survey over 1,000 teachers in the state of New Mexico. The majority of them were white, but there are also large numbers of Hispano-Latino teachers. About half of them were elementary and about half secondary. When I asked the question, are you familiar with the concept of culturally responsive pedagogy or multicultural education? 95% of them indicated that they were. And in a write-in section, they said that they had learned about these concepts in their teacher preparation program. But later in the survey, when I asked how they would explain the academic struggles of most or many of their students, and they had a list of things that they could choose from, the vast majority chose students or their homes. And they indicated things such as student apathy, misbehavior, motivation, families and communities not supporting education, poverty. There was also a category that they chose less of administrative factors like too much testing, large class sizes, and only a few indicated teaching factors, such as lack of cultural relevance in teaching, poor teaching, or low expectations. So what this told me was, despite the teachers' familiarity in their view with culturally responsive pedagogy and multicultural education, they were still viewing their students from a deficit perspective. They were not using what they had learned as a way of reinterpreting and understanding their students. So whatever we do in teacher education has to be powerful, because it's not just understanding some concepts, but it involves reworking some deeply embedded assumptions that are rooted in white supremacy. Now, what might this look like? Next slide, please. I want to draw here from an article that was published in Ed Week by some white teachers teaching Black history, because I thought this was a really good example of people whose perspective has been transformed and who are doing a real good job teaching Black history as a result. And I know one of the teachers who wrote this article, so I know that there's a lot of authenticity here. The first point that they talked about was the need for ongoing self-reflection, which includes attention to your identity, your location in the social structure, the privileges associated with whiteness, and blind spots that you have in your own learning and understanding. And they emphasize that this has to be ongoing. It can't just be one activity that's done in one course, because it needs to become a part of a teacher's ongoing learning. And the teacher needs to get past being self-defensive about learning, because when you're self-defensive, you're not really learning. A second point they mentioned is the importance of learning ethnic studies content. And particularly, they were talking about Black studies content, since that's what they were teaching, for a couple of reasons. One is that most of us, having been through a white stream education system, haven't learned very much content about people who aren't white, and our content knowledge about then how society works from perspectives of minoritized groups isn't very deep. And learning ethnic studies content will give that broader, deeper perspective. And also, for being able to teach multicultural content, you need the content. You can't teach what you don't know. The teachers also talked about how important it is to learn how their students engage with that content every day. For example, they were teaching Black history and how the Black students engage in knowledge of the Black community and knowledge of Black history, and have knowledge that they can bring into the classroom every day. They're not the experts necessarily, but the kids know things often that the teachers don't. A third thing that they talked about was the importance of including and centering Black or other people of color perspectives. That the white perspective is so embedded in the curriculum and in the ways of doing schooling that often we don't see that until we actually step out of it into a perspective that's other than white. A fourth thing that they talked about was the need to learn how to learn from your students, their families, and their communities. For several years as a teacher educator, I included with my coursework community-based learning, where I collaborated with grassroots community organizations and then had my students doing work in the community, and then worked with them on learning how to learn from the community and how to translate what they were learning into their work as teachers. But teachers also need to learn to feel uncomfortable in that process and to just work through the discomfort, because any of us walking into somebody else's community is going to be uncomfortable at times. And then their last point is that as a teacher, your allegiance is to your students and not to the processes and people that dehumanize them. And this is huge, because so much of what goes on in schools does dehumanize a lot of students who are in the classrooms, and teachers need to be able to recognize the barriers of racism that students experience in school every day and be allies of their students, not allies to those barriers. In this webinar, there will be a number of strategies that you'll learn, and I'll just share one, which is, next slide, please, a powerful form of self-reflection on identity, social location, and privileges. Next slide. This responds to what Bree Picower here is describing as a common white narrative, where she was discussing pre-service teachers that she had worked with as creating this hegemonic story about their ancestors pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and everybody ought to be able to do that. And this made me think about, as a teacher educator myself, the extent to which for most of us, our ideas about how society works and our own location within that society come from our understanding of narratives that we've learned within our families, which are very powerful. So I've been working on processes for unpacking that narrative. Next slide, please. Next slide. And I've been working on a process that I call critical family history, which is essentially locating one's family within historic contexts that are shaped by membership in sociocultural groups, in social and conflict over power and resources. Next slide, please. The process involves both genealogical research as well as context research. And it's the context research that I really emphasize. The genealogy research, I've listed some sources here. So much of this is now available digitally that sometimes when I've been giving like 2-hour workshops, people dive into the genealogy research and just in 2 hours start uncovering a whole lot about their families. But placing the information about your family in a broader context is what a lot of people don't think of doing. Next slide, please. So I use this process of situating your family within both a historical context, and I'll have for family, it may be your grandparents, great-grandparents, but take a family unit and then situate it within a historical context and within a social context that asks the question of who else was around, what other groups were around or could have been around if there weren't laws and processes keeping people from being there. What were the relationships among groups? What particularly were the power relations? And this framework starts getting at systems of race and class within which families have been embedded historically. Next slide, please. Now, I'm retired, so I've only actually used this process with teachers once, and it was really powerful. For a number of them, it was very powerful in having them do some deep internal thinking. But I recently ran across somebody who's been doing it for a number of years with undergraduate students, and she's more focused the project in terms of having the students ask these kinds of questions. Is there a family history connected to slavery? Did anyone in previous generations inherit property, money, or businesses? Did parents or grandparents receive down payment help for purchasing a home or assistance with college? Did the family take advantage of formal programs that would facilitate wealth capital accumulation, like the Homestead Act or the GI Bill? And did anyone use social networks to get jobs, secure loans, and open businesses? Next slide, please. And she found also a lot of learning on the part of her students. Students gained an understanding of racialized structural hierarchy and positions and deconstructed stories of hard work. Students of color learn to recognize structural advantage. And she makes the point is that students come into the class thinking of racism in terms of individual prejudice, but most don't have a systemic view of racism and don't know how to locate their families now or historically and how all of that worked. And this process helps them develop that view. They understood the role of colorblind ideology in blinding us to paying attention to how racism works. And as a result, many became inspired to tackle systemic racism. Next slide, please. So I've been working on writing fiction that makes visible for teachers the Family History Research Project, Structural Racism, and Teacher Agency. These are the 3 novels that I have that have been published right now. Family History in Black and White that looks at racism now and historically through experiences of African Americans and white Americans. The Inheritance that looks at white people's wealth derived from the theft of Indigenous people's lands through homesteading. And these ask the question of then as a teacher, as you're coming to understand this about yourself, what do you do with this information? And then White Bread looks at Euro-Americans' loss of culture, language, and historical memory and context of Mexican Americans losing the same things. I'm working on one now that addresses the anti-Chinese activism that's been a part of this country for a long time, partly because one of my ancestors was a white Chinese activist in San Francisco. And I need to understand what that was all about and what I can do to redress what she tried to put into motion. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, you can't fully respect the ethnic identity of students and their communities without deconstructing a dominant narrative about how society works. And it's a narrative that we've all learned. For teachers of color, it's more complicated because teachers of color have also learned the opposite narrative. But for white teachers, often it's the only one that we've learned. So I've offered one learning experience that tries to get at structural racism and one's familial position within that. But to get from a perspective that focuses on remediation and assimilation and sometimes cultural celebration to a focus around dismantling barriers of racism and building on cultural and community and familial strengths. Teachers need not just one good, strong activity, but a constellation of powerful learning experiences in teacher education. Thank you. And our next speaker will be Carolina Valdez.
Thank you so much. Hi. Thank you for having me. I am excited to be presenting the work that I've been working on here at Cal State Fullerton. So my presentation is entitled Mirrors, Windows, Frames, and Foundations, a Pathway to Develop Elementary Ethnic Studies Educators. And I want to also note that although I'm the one here presenting today, that this what I'm presenting has been in collaboration with my colleagues, Dr. Scott and Lori Dickey. Next slide, please. I want to begin with how I came to this work, what brought me to this work. And the story starts with me growing up as a child in a suburb in San Diego. I grew up in San Marcos, California, which when I grew up there in the 80s was not as diverse as it is now, thanks to things like Cal State San Marcos and bringing in some diverse families. And so I specifically grew up, next slide, please, in a very white elementary school. I was one of the few brown faces in my classes. I received a relatively good education. We read real books. We took a ton of field trips. I had an art teacher that pushed in just for art. We had a PE teacher that pulled us out just for PE. We had plays. There was a band and choir. However, I never saw myself included in any of the curriculum that I was presented at this elementary school. Next slide, please. And that's where my mother came in. I was very lucky that I had my mother. My mother was a bilingual kindergarten teacher and very, very passionate, right, about supporting her community. So her knowledge, right, of culturally responsive teaching supplemented with books. Next slide, please. And so I still recall the day that she brought home my first Gary Soto book. And it was the first book that I had ever seen with brown characters. And I read it like start to finish. I was mind blown that these characters looked like me, lived lives like me, were getting into mischief like me. And so although I learned to read in elementary school formally, I didn't learn to love to read until my mother brought these books to me where I could connect with the literature I was reading. Next, yeah, thank you. And so another example I have is that she provided critical counter narratives. And so in fourth grade, my teacher had planned a field trip to the battle site of San Pasqual, right? We were learning about the Mexican-American War, and we were gonna have a picnic there. And my mom didn't let me go. And at that time, I was upset because I just wanted to be with my friends and go on a field trip. But she made it very clear that she wasn't going to allow me to go have a picnic at a place that minimized our family's ancestry, the blood that was shed there, that essentially did not provide any of our connections with that experience in history, right? Next slide, please. So before speaking to this, all those experiences, right? When I started teaching, I knew that I wanted to provide the education that I never got, which is, hands-on, engaging, however, centering marginalized stories, right? Centering stories and experiences of people of color, of queer folks, trans folks, et cetera. So that's what I did, and that's what my dissertation research ended up looking at. And so when I joined Cal State Fullerton, I was implementing this in my courses that I taught, but I felt the need to create, we have several cohorts, a cohort specifically designated to, we're gonna discuss this and we're gonna implement these strategies in every single subject class that you have. So not just designated to one class, or as Dr. Sleeter said before, just, oh, you're gonna add one article to each class, but how are we actually embedding this across the work that we're already doing? So when I started this block, I invited faculty with the foundation and background in race and ethnicity to teach within it, because as was noted earlier, you have to have that content. You have to have those experiences and knowledge of it, to be able to actually rethink your frameworks and embed it across. And then teacher candidates had to request, after being admitted, to specifically be placed in this block. And so we asked several questions about their background in ethnic studies and their goals for implementing ethnic studies in their future teaching. Thank you. So knowing that they need to have a foundation, right, in the content of ethnic studies, there are a few ways that we took that into account. First, I really want to congratulate our college who has really pushed the way when the CSU was still deciding or just finding out if we were going to get that one ethnic studies course requirement for undergrad graduation. We decided to push it forward and say, regardless of what is decided, we're going to require that our candidates take at least 2 ethnic studies courses by the year 2023 to be admitted. And that's in any cohort, not just my specific one. If you're going to teach children in California, you need to have the content knowledge of the various ethnic groups you're working with. So we made it that requirement. It did provide preference for the following year. Another one though, can you click it one more time? Go back, sorry. Somehow my text disappeared. Another one, but understanding is that there's other ways to get this content knowledge, right? That it doesn't have to be in formal ethnic studies programs, and understanding that most of my political development happened in grassroots community organizations, right? Happened through self-education. So when I first started teaching in LA, I had taken several formal Chicano studies classes in my undergrad. I knew nothing about the Black experience in this country. And so it started with Malcolm X, right? Reading that, and it blew my mind because I knew so little. So it was like, okay, I got to learn more. Then I read Asada. Then it was, okay, what do I not know about the Black Panther Party? How come I've never heard about survival programs, right? Because that's not the narrative that, if they are ever discussed, that's ever mentioned. So understanding that there are also other ways of self-educating and getting that ethnic studies foundation. So then what we did was, as faculty, we got together last summer, because this last year was our first year implementing it, a sort of pilot study. And we read several articles, and we came together and basically co-developed, okay, here's our understanding of what we're going to present in our ethnic studies frameworks. So the first was that it needs to be culturally relevant, and centering that it can't be essentialist, right? It can't present one cultural group as one way, and understanding that even when looking at ethnic groups, it's complex, right? And there's diversity. It has to be community responsive. It has to center social action, right? Ethnic studies was born out of social movements. And so understanding that it can't just be intellectualized. It must be anti-racist and decolonial. And so centering an understanding of the violent dispossession of land and labor of Indigenous people, but also within that, questioning which knowledge is valid, right? Which oftentimes is presented as only European knowledge, right? It must be intersectional, right? It must be ethnicity and gender, ethnicity and class, ethnicity and sexuality. And the last being that it can't just be what you're teaching. It's not just content-based, it's literally your being, right? If you are oppressive to other people, whether it's colleagues or your students, and policing them in behavior management, then that's not ethnic studies. And so then after having that discussion, each instructor completed a curricular map to really see where are we embedding these approaches across our courses. And sometimes that meant that faculty that felt like they needed a little bit more attended additional webinars. For instance, like UCLA hosts several on ethnic studies in K through 12 to gain that knowledge. So some examples of how we were able to do this across coursework. The foundations course is a boot camp of sort for all things teaching related. You can go ahead and click them all for this slide. One more. There you go. That way you don't have to guess. So examples of embedding across. First thing, when we're doing introductions, instead of the, hey, tell me a fact about yourself, tell me about your ethnic identities. How do you identify, right? And understanding that that can vary by context. So in some contexts, I might say, you know, I'm Latina, in another, I'm Mexicana, in another, I'm Chicana, right? And that all those are valid and real. And introducing ourselves that way, right? Reflecting on, well, how do I identify ethnically? Again, of course, having readings, right? So readings on ethnic studies pedagogy, readings on cultural wealth, readings on translanguaging embedded, but also even just with the example lessons. So when we would learn different models of instruction, such as, direct instruction, but as well as group investigation, the 5Es, the examples I actually shared and presented to them were examples of ethnic studies lessons. Analyzing, right? So unfortunately, a common practice in elementary schooling is scripted curriculum. And so understanding, okay, you might be at a district that's mandating you have to teach this, but how do you analyze it and subvert what's being presented within that curriculum? And so in this example, it was a unit on westward expansion that was presenting it as this fun, adventurous experience, right? But then looking at it, having students reflect, okay, well, whose narratives were not included in this fun, adventurous experience? Indigenous peoples. And so finding core literature at elementary levels that could be used to supplement that, right? How do we counter what's being forced in that mandated curriculum? As I said earlier, being is a part of this pedagogy. And so pushing back on the policing nature of classroom management in elementary spaces to center restorative justice practices. And then finally, right, their signature assignment, you have this final lesson plan. Our department uses Bree Picower's 6 Elements of Social Justice across all cohorts because we do center JEIE. But in my class, it has to be, okay, if you're picking one of those elements, it has to intersect with race and ethnicity. How are you doing this in your practice and developing standards-based lessons for your context? Next slide, please. Other examples from the literacy course, again, readings, right? We centered these ethnic studies pedagogical readings across all courses. Class activities, when they were practicing various literacy activities, they were centering ethnic studies literature. Example, One Crazy Summer, which is a book that presents the Black Panther Party and all the survival programs, right, that they provided through the lens of young children that actually benefited from those programs and participated in them. And then an example of an assignment is When the Principal Asks, right? So students have to develop a paper where they back up their choices, right, in this literature with research, with standards, with California policy, so that should they encounter resistance, right, from the principal, AE, or parents, right, they have the pedagogical tools to really explain and back up their choices. Okay, another example in our social studies course, course materials, obviously, so bringing in like texts such as A Young People's History of the United States, bringing in documentaries like Two Spirits, again, analyzing scripted social studies curriculum to see how they can subvert it, flip it, and then in their final unit, they have to, an assignment, their final unit is to develop an ethnic studies unit that implements 2 or more of the tenets that we presented in our framework. Some math examples, first, centering non-European understandings of math and understanding that math was not invented in Europe, right? It existed globally around the world, and there are indigenous understandings of it as well. And then creating lessons, right, that are still practicing those skills that they need to intersectionally. But also looking at, okay, well, how can math be used as a tool to fight racial injustice, right? So looking at, the income gap and wealth gaps between different racial groups. Next slide, please. Science. So examples, right? So in addition to the other things I've already mentioned and other examples such as readings and class activities, is having students actually look at standards, look at example lessons, and brainstorm connections. So on a unit on weather, okay, we're going to study hurricanes. How do they develop? What's the science behind that? And then we're going to connect that with a reflection and a critical dialogue around who is most affected, right? Let's look at some of the recent cases of hurricanes. Which people are most affected by these disasters? Poor working class communities of color, right? That are not receiving the same structures and support as affluent communities. Another example would be when looking at the water cycle. Okay, we have this great lesson. We learned that water is finite, right? Clear drinking water is finite. However, let's draw connections that when Indigenous people organize to protect their water, right? How are they met? Are they, congratulated because scientifically we know there is a finite amount of it, or are they met with military grade weapons, right? And so drawing those connections that everything we do is interconnected to ethnic studies. So something I do want to say that we've struggled with this year is finding teaching placements that model the pedagogy that we're attempting to prepare our teacher candidates to do, let alone just even if you can't model it, are you open to us doing it and modeling it for you? So that's been our biggest struggle this year. Looking forward, I'm hopeful because next year, candidates that I've been preparing who have now reached the 3-year mark required by the CTC are excited to host. And so now they will actually be able to see what we're preparing them to do with their mentor teachers, and it will be welcomed and supported in their teaching placement so that there's that alignment across our coursework and their preparation and into what they're actually able to practice in their placements. And I believe, next slide, that is it. Thank you. Now I would like to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Dietrich Adelbu.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the East Coast, where we've got just almost an inch of snow this morning, so wish I could be there with you all. I'd also like to acknowledge this morning that the territory on which Boston University stands is that of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. I'm a former first-generation college student who attended segregated, predominantly African-American schools in rural Louisiana. From kindergarten until 12th grade, my teachers were African-American and so were my peers. I remember thinking that my teachers were beautiful, they were glamorous, and I wanted to be exactly like them. They were models to me for what could be possible. We read books and recited poetry written by African-Americans. I could name African-American leaders and inventors as easily as I could recite the alphabet. These early experiences affirmed me and helped me to feel a strong, positive connection to what it means to be African-American. I learned that at the core of who I am as an African-American is a powerful story of resilience, of love, and of forgiveness. I'm here at this moment, and I strongly believe I am here at this moment because my teachers affirmed me as an African-American all those years ago. And so those early experiences really led me to a deep interest in studying and examining ethnic identity. So this afternoon, I'd like to speak with you about connections between a strong and positive ethnic identity and student outcomes. And I'd also like to share some of the priorities in my classes that help to affirm and sustain a strong and positive ethnic identity for students from racially and ethnically diverse backgrounds. Next slide, please. So studies show that students who have a positive ethnic identity, these are students who have been affirmed for their race, their ethnicity, their culture, that these students are more likely to achieve academically, to engage in school through active participation in academic and extracurricular activities. These are the students who are engaged, they're invested within the school community. Similarly, students who are affirmed based on their race and ethnicity have a stronger and more positive sense of self, and are more likely to believe that they can navigate difficult obstacles. Perhaps what is most salient is that students who have been affirmed based on their race, ethnicity, and culture are less susceptible to the impact of race. And given the racial reckoning we are experiencing as a nation, a strong, positive ethnic identity is particularly important in the lives of Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous students. Next slide, please. Can you go back? There, yes. So the question for us as educators is, how do we affirm and sustain the ethnic identity of students from diverse ethnic backgrounds? And I'd say that there are 4 areas that I tend to prioritize in my work with current and aspiring students in my courses. And so in my courses, we engage in personal reflection and knowledge building. We work to cultivate ethnic identity affirming spaces where students learn and play. We also partner with families and communities to affirm and sustain students' ethnic identity. And we work to actively engage to dismantle systems that disavow students of an affirming ethnic identity. And so looking at the first priority, many of us attended colleges and universities, and back one slide. you'll be there for a little bit. So many of us attended colleges and universities that espouse a colonized approach to teaching and learning. And for the most part, we tend to teach what we've been taught. We also tend to teach the way that we've been taught. So as educators, it is important for us to reflect on our own positionality, and we all have positionality. We all have, experiences that have shaped and continue to shape how we view the world, how we experience the world, how we walk through this world. And this is a piece that I, spent quite a bit of time on with my students, and that we all have positionality. And that this shapes our teaching and learning experiences within our classes, rooms, and within our schools. And so, I'm asking students to reflect on questions like, how does my race, ethnicity, and culture shape what I've deemed to be important within the context of my classroom in terms of the information that I'm bringing into the classroom? How is it shaped? How is it guided by my own social location, by my own positionality? And how is it that I sort of use what I'm learning about myself and about my students to shape the types of learning that occurs within my classroom? I ask students to think about what is it that they already know, and how will they learn more about the historical, political, and lived experiences of their students. And as educators, it's also important for us to really think about the assets that students are bringing into the classroom. So what are the assets of my students? What are the assets that are present within the school community? What are the assets that are present within the broader community? And how do I begin to bring those assets into the classroom? And so there are a few things that we do that's focused on this first priority. And the first thing is, I think you've heard this morning, is just that it's so important for us to continue to engage in ongoing education, self-education, continuing to read and read some more is how I share this with my students. The other piece is, I have my students conduct a personal learning journey where they go through their day-to-day lives, their day-to-day activities, and think about how often they have the opportunity to really engage with individuals from diverse ethnic backgrounds. And usually my students will say, all the time. I mean, I'm always interacting. And then I add another level to this, and I say, now I'd like you to think about the times when you've engaged with individuals from diverse ethnic backgrounds who are of an equal status to you. So not someone that you greet in the grocery store when you're picking up your Starbucks, but individuals that you are engaged in relationship with who are of an equal status. And then the conversation starts to shift, and they start to really have to think about more critically about the kinds of relationships they have, because you can't really talk about, think about, teach about ethnic identity if we haven't really spent the time to get to know individuals who are from diverse backgrounds. We've built up a level of comfort in engaging with individuals from diverse backgrounds. And then I asked them to, spend time thinking about who was at your last birthday party, who was at your last cookout, who was at your last Thanksgiving dinner. And so, again, it's important for us as educators to really be able to have those kinds of relationships if we're going to be able to connect with the students who are in our classrooms. Another activity that we engage in my classes is what I call an asset map. And this is when I go out into the community with my students, and I have them to start to map and document the various resources that are available within the communities that their students live, grow. And that also helps them to gain a better sense of, there are assets that are present within the communities that our students are living in. How do we start to bring those assets into our classrooms? And just imagine if students are talking about an experience in the community, and as an educator, you can say, oh yeah, that's right next door to X. And students get a sense of, oh wow, my teacher has a sense of my community. And that's, again, a way to really affirm our students and to affirm their identities by getting to know, and I say it's not their community, it's all of our communities. And because we all share the same community. And so we share the communities of the students who are present within our classrooms. And I also say that I enter those spaces with my students, because I think it's important for me as a professor to, if I'm going to send my students out into the community, it's important that I'm also willing to enter those communities with them. And so I'm on that asset mapping exercise with my students. And I also teach community-based courses where I'm teaching my classes 50% of the time within the community. And again, this builds the sense that, we're not disconnected. We're all part of the same community. A second priority is, cultivating ethnic identity affirming spaces where students learn and play. And we affirm students, and we can affirm or not affirm students in so many ways, but we affirm students in how we interact with them. We affirm them in the curriculum that we have within our classes. We affirm our students in how we structure and care for the physical spaces where students learn and play. And so as educators, it's important for us to really reflect on how do we center the identities and lived experiences of racially and ethnically diverse students represented within our classrooms and within our schools. When was the last time we paused to ask our students, what is it that they need and what is it that we can do to better support their needs? This again affirms the voices of the students, and in turn, it affirms them as individuals. So affirming the ethnic identity of students can really happen in every classroom, in every subject, in every space within our schools. And so often my students who are in math and science, they will say, math is math. What do you mean? How do we incorporate or how do we affirm ethnic identity within a math and science course? And I point my students to more culturally responsive approaches to math and science. I point them towards ethnomathematics curriculum so they can start to really look at how do we connect ethnicity, how do we connect culture to math and science? And so some of the examples that students have come up with is, looking at a curriculum that incorporates African-American hair braiding. What are some of the mathematical patterns that are found in African-American hair braiding? What are some of the mathematical patterns that are found within indigenous basket weaving within their curriculum? And again, it's also just encouraging our aspiring and current teachers to really talk to students about their interests and to try to, really incorporate those interests within the context of the class. Something else that I prioritize in my work with my students is partnering with families and communities to affirm and sustain students' ethnic identity. And as educators, it really is important for us to look around and to really see and to know who are the individuals who are doing the kinds of work that's affirming the ethnic identity of students, and to think about how can we partner and how can we ally with them? How can we learn from them? How can we learn from the parents and community organizations? And how can we start to bring those, again, organizations within the context of our class? And so, for example, if a student has decided to integrate ethnomathematics or culturally sustaining approaches to mathematics or science within their classes, then how can we reach out to parenting adults, or how can we reach out to community organizations to come into the classroom to demonstrate hair braiding and talk about the history of hair braiding within the African-American community? And another priority, the final priority that I'll talk about today is, so how do we actively engage in dismantling the systems that disavow students of an affirming ethnic identity? And so as educators, what steps can we take to decolonize the curriculum in our classroom and in educator preparation programs? And how do we use our voices to advocate for critical professional development and resources to help us affirm and sustain the ethnic identity of our ethnically diverse students? And so not just professional development, but professional development that's teaching us about the history and the background of the students that are enrolled in our class, classes that are teaching us about historic and systemic racism and how racism impacts just the life opportunities of the students who are present. And how do we advocate for more coursework within our educator preparation programs that prepare us to sustain the ethnic identity of our students, so that we're not back here in 10 years, having the same conversation. And so, I would say when I'm talking to my students, it's like, I feel like it starts with us as professors, and it's doing the work to really create and to build courses that are grounded in diversity, grounded in equity, grounded in sort of helping students learn about the history of various groups within our community, within society. And so I encourage my students to reach back to their educator preparation programs to advocate for courses that promote an understanding of their own race and ethnicity, as well as the race and ethnicity of others. And I also just advocate that, if that doesn't work, I encourage them to reach out to their peers, to other alums, to collectively lend their voice to really advocate for more diversity within our teacher education programs, particularly as it relates to the coursework Other pieces that I think we can do around dismantling systems and really advocating for systems that affirm students' ethnic identity is also really working with systems that work to increase the number of teachers from racially and culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and then examining those systems and practices within our own schools that are maybe inhibiting diversity within our teaching field, but that also may disavow our students from, building and creating a more sort of positive and strong ethnic identity. And so this work is really as intentional, as continuous. Students change, our schools change, communities change, and it really is important for us to be ready to change with them. And so therefore, the importance of us really continuing to engage in the learning process, continuing to really advocate for, again, more diversity within our teacher preparation programs at the level of courses, but also, I'm sure, also at the level of faculty as well. And then working to build more initiatives that will diversify the teaching field, because we know that students who are in classrooms with teachers who look like them, that those students tend to describe themselves as having more positive experiences within the school community. And so what is it that we can do to diversify the teaching field, and what are some barriers to diversity, and how do we dismantle those barriers? Next slide, please. And so the next few slides, I'm not going to read these off or anything, but these are reflection questions that I think we should all consider as individuals and in the field of education. And I also think that these are questions that should be included within our educator preparation programs. And so I'm going to slowly go through the slides and give you an opportunity to screenshot them. And also I'll share a slide that provides some good resources to support our work. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. I hope you're able to screenshot and you're having enough time to do this. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you so much. It definitely is my pleasure. It has been a pleasure to speak with you this morning. And now I would like to pass on the presentation to Professor Brandon Yu.
Thank you. My name is Brandon Yu. I am a 1.5 generation Korean American, Asian American, cisgender, straight and able-bodied. And I think these are the many ways in which I think about my racial identity in this complex ways. And I think with that, I also need to recognize the privileges that are within these identities that often may sort of clout in terms of how I sort of see and teach about racism and racial identity of Asian Americans. I had originally sort of planned a script for today's presentation, but I don't think I can read that today. I am feeling a lot of different things, but primarily exhausted, and to be honest, numb. I did my graduate work at University of Minnesota, and right now I'm thinking a lot about Dante Wright and his family, and the toll and how incomprehensible the daily violence are experienced by African Americans and African American families in this country. I am feeling heavy with how the location where Dante Wright was murdered, it was only miles away from where George Floyd was, and Philando Castile before that in Minnesota. And I'm trying to process all of this with my students, my family, my community. while we have to say, stop hate against Asian Americans, I need to say Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter every day. I think lately it's just been this one barrage of over another after another, where we have not had time to process and make sense of all of these violence and experience of racism. I think for me, what gives me strength to even show up today, quite honestly, are my colleagues and their amazing work. I think what brings me here today is that as I think about how I create space and show the value of facilitating or teaching or learning about racism, racial identity of Asian Americans, I see my community, I see my students around me just moving, mobilizing, finding space to heal, to act against white supremacy, to resist, to challenge. And I see that is not only in my classrooms, but that is connected to a larger community, both local and national, and how we find ourselves in a wide range of emotions, but they're moving to create space. And I think at the heart of this, that sense of ancestors and community is how I think about racism and racial identity for Asian Americans, and more importantly, how we cannot understand the psychological experience of racism and racial identity unless we understand the historical context that provides meaning in that experience. I think, like many others here today, my central thesis is a simple one, that we need Asian American studies in all of our curriculum. And I think when I say we need Asian American studies in our curriculum, it means that we need African and African American studies in our curriculum. It means that we need Latinx and Indigenous studies in our curriculum. We need women and gender studies in our curriculum. Because I think our experiences are tied, interconnected. And the importance of this is so important to disentangle and how we sort of think about in the ways in which we learn and teach this. Next slide, please. When I think about being an expert on racial identity, especially with any groups, let alone Asian Americans, I'm often uncomfortable with that title because I recognize and slowly learn and grow to see the tremendous diversity within the coinage of what Asian American means. It's not one of the fastest group with 20 plus ethnic groups and if you to include Pacific Islanders, over 50 plus with over 100 different languages. It's not only the diversity of their traditions, values, and languages, but also the diverse social, economic, immigration, motivation, reasons that bring them into this country. Next slide, please. Is what Erica Lee calls a historian, the 21st century Asian American, who share not only a common racialized history of struggles and agencies, but that are transnational immigrants, global Americans who have families here as well as across seas, who are diverse in age, ethnicities, immigration, history, refugees, transracial adoptees, multiracials, class, gender, and sexuality. There is a lot to unpack there. The meaning of racial identity for a third generational Filipino queer woman is not going to be the same as the meaning for a first generation Asian Indian who has a family still here and back home. How we think about the inclusion of racial identity and the importance of racial identity, even for Asian Americans in our curriculum, must go beyond the often sort of generalized stereotypes of what we think about Asian Americans. Next slide, please. I've recently had to tell my parents to just stay home because I didn't know how to deal with all of this. I think about these moments like the landmass shooting to recognize that these are not isolated incidents, but a long and historical one. I recognize that these incidents of white supremacy are not just experienced by individuals that look Asian, but are disproportionately experienced by those that are women and carry other minoritized identities. Next slide, please. Next slide. I think about the rise and the continual hate and how I'm supposed to have this conversation with my children and my students in creating safe spaces, in providing all of the amazing things that was previously sort of discussed by the panelists. And I struggle with having to continually explain the existence of our communities. And having to need to say, stop API hate. Next slide, please. Next slide. And I think for me, next slide. Next slide. As we continue to highlight the importance and seriousness of racism and racial identity and how we understand it, we must really begin to address what racism means in this country, and in particular, how it looks in our curricula, in our educational system. Often when we think about racism, we often think about, next slide, please, and talk about it still on an individual level, where it's focused on individual intentional acts of meanness, where questions of racism focuses on the perpetrator and their motives. Next slide. It does not recognize that racism is something so much more, that it is a system of dominance, power, and privilege specifically attached to the idea of whiteness and white people. That is just a simple fact of the history of race and racism in this country. It is an ideological value around whiteness that has translated to justify or rationalize not only slavery, genocide, and the continual violence against people of color, but has been transformed into every aspect of our society. From individual, interpersonal norms to cultural, to structural. That today, even there is no area in our life, in education, how much money we make, to how long we live, that is not determined by racial disparities. Next slide, please. And I recognize that our experience of racism are not the same. The reason why we need to understand the importance of racial identity across these groups is because we have been racially stratified and organized differently in this country to support white supremacy and white folks. Even shortly after, in this survey on March 1825, we can see that our assumptions and discrimination and stereotypes about Black people, about Latinx people, about Asian people are very different. And they're very different intentionally because their experiences are different to maintain and normalize what is whiteness. Our groups are pitted up against one another to maintain these ideas. Next slide, please. Specifically, I think about Asian Americans and how they have been throughout history, been positioned between the idea of white and anti-Blackness to rationalize, to justify, how they've been constructed as the Oriental, next slide, in so many ways and in too many terms, both negative and positive, to rationalize and justify, again, white supremacy in our society, and while being at the same time uplifted by anti-Blackness. It means Asians are constantly shifting between those two groups and ideals in such ways to justify and benefit from being not Black. Next slide, please. I think the origin of this understanding of what our racial identity means within the context of racism is so important. It's so important because these histories, the experiences of how we understand Asian Americans as being the yellow peril or forever foreign, to being the model minority, or somehow the group that can succeed above and beyond African American Latinx through hard work. And the ideas of Asian American women being hypersexualized and Asian American men being asexual are not new stereotypes, but a long-standing one. A long-standing one where we don't recognize that Asians in this country have been here well before this country was founded, with Filipinos in 1587 arriving on the shores of Morro Bay, California. I think about the many events from the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment camp, to today of anti-Asian hate that maintain and it sustains itself through these narratives and caricatures. Next slide. These moments of oppression and the experience of racism for Asian Americans, which are absent in our curriculum, which are absent in our stories, which are absent, period, are also moments of resilience and resistance. That more importantly, what it meant to be Asian American was to work and understand that being Korean, Chinese, Filipino, we're similar in this, our struggle against white supremacy and imperialism in this country, that we have worked not only across ethnic lines, but across gender, sexuality, and more importantly, across racial lines to understand who we are as a people, to resist and challenge. These are seen, of course, throughout history by large groups of individuals, but also thinking about Walmart Kim, Fred Korimasu, Larry Italon, Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, and so many others today, my colleagues, who demonstrate and show how we work across groups, how our children must understand, my children must understand that what it means to be Asian American is not a siloed experience of Asians in America, but this interconnectedness. And more importantly, resilience and resistance. Next slide, please. These are connected to the ways in which Asian Americans have been complicit with white racism, as well as the ways in which we today continually challenge. Next slide, please. I struggle, again, continually in how we understand the current moment is tied to these past historical moments and the necessity to understand that connection, as history knows no boundaries between our past and present. Next slide. I think about the importance of the work and, again, the value of our history to our current understanding and meaning and teaching of what racial identity means for Asian Americans as well as other minoritized groups, and how that means such varied things within a given group. That racial identity, again, must be emphasized with the diversity of Asian Americans means multiple things, and there is no particular cookie cutter script or paradigm that could explain this diversity. Next slide. And even as we look to its effects on outcomes, it do vary within groups as well. Even in my own research, how Asian Americans navigate their ethnic identity and dealing with discrimination depends on a number of ecological factors, including their nativity status, their gender, sexuality, among other factors that shows complexity in the meaning making. Next slide. There are books like this, as well as others that have presented today that shows how we can talk about this. Next slide. Our labs have done research where we have try to incorporate these historical aspects today of who we are in terms of recognizing the diversity, the intersectionality of that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and looking at how systems of overlapping oppressions, gender, sexism, the importance of interracial solidarity and importance of transnational critical consciousness, or idea that Asian Americans are not bounded by the boundaries here in the US, but are global. And as we think about these themes important to racial identity, how they're important to not only just our physical or mental health outcome, but the ways in which we engage with our society in terms of awareness of critical consciousness, deconstructing, internalizing racism. Next slide. And I think when I talk about the importance of Asian American history, I'm reminded that it teaches our children that racialized violence and disproportionate harm to people of color are not new, isolated, or comparable across racial groups. Rather, they're historical, intersectional, and rooted in racism well before our country was founded. I'm reminded that as a student of mine recently, a brilliant student of mine who actually had no major overlap in her degree with Asian American Studies, continually take our classes. And she reminded that the reason why she continued to take our classes was because Asian American Studies provided her with an origin story. It provided her with the facts that she is not new and her story is not new here. That when you understand the origin studies of perpetual foreigner, yellow peril, kung flu is not about me, but this larger system in history, we can avoid internalizing those messages. We can recognize it is a structure and not us who are the problems, which often happens. She reminded me that not only do we gain our origin stories from Asian American Studies, but that we are interconnected. Not only through our ancestors' struggles, resilience, and resistance, but also across groups and across communities. That to understand, again, Asian American Studies is to understand Black studies, Latinx studies, gender and sexuality, because those are interconnected narratives that are part of what it means to be Asian American. Next slide, please. And so lastly, next slide, yep, one more. I'm not sure how much time I have. I was gonna start a clock and I'm completely, one back, please. Not mindful of where I am. But I do wanna just reiterate what many of my colleagues said in terms of the importance of our work on facilitating ethnic racial identity, that we must look at it as a system, not changing a particular teacher or a particular school or a particular curriculum, but hopefully in addition to, we can change the entire system that is too focused on the experience of whites and from white perspectives. We can focus on our own exploration and critical consciousness and how we provide space for our students, bringing and drawing in on their strengths, their agency, our community, our history. But at the same time, again, to echo everyone else, the necessity to change the structures in which who is teaching our class, what are they teaching, how are they teaching it, and where are they teaching it? That to properly address it, to understand racial identity cannot be a peripheral chapter inclusion, but rather central to everything that we do, from arts, music, science, social science, to history, to literature. That to tell an Asian American story is a story of American story, that to not have these stories of minoritized groups is not about an issue of only underrepresentation, but a very intentional and historical exclusion. I think to write that, we must do more than just fill in, but think about how we rework our teachers' education, our schools, in valuing all of our racial identities. that is it. That is all the energy I have today. I thank everyone for sharing this space with me and my colleagues who are much better at articulating the details of the importance of this work. Thank you for your time and space. I also lastly want to thank here the people who are much more better knowledge in Asian American studies and racial identity than I am in my school, Asian Pacific American Studies at Arizona State University. That as historians, as geographers, sociologists, lit professors that come from multiple perspectives and giving me the patience and teaching me what it means to be Asian American and how I try to now create that in psychology and space for other students. I thank them. I thank the larger school of social transformation with the diverse ways in which we work and study and teach racial justice and what anti-racism means from an intersectionality lens. I think the larger organizations, Asian American Psychological Association, Society of Research on Adolescence, and the people who have given me strength and energy to, again, show up here today to provide the importance of our work, not as a peripheral, but central to everything that we do. Thank you. I would like to next hand off the presentation to Dr. Antoinette Linton.
Good morning, everybody. I've been over here in tears since Dr. Yu started talking. In the African-American tradition and in the African-American church, we would have said he just preached a word, right? So in light of that, I've been cutting up in the chat this whole time because this has been a very powerful presentation. And I guess my presentation would be a testimony. The doors of the church are open and if anybody wants to join it, I would be the first one to stand up. I'm coming up. I'm going to give my testimony today. This work comes out of my experience as a teacher, my experience as a teacher educator and a science educator. Next slide. I like to piggyback on Dr. Yu with humanizing our stories, right? The little girl you see right there went through an experience to become a professor at a university. And I'm actually currently doing a video series for Jefferson County Public Schools to inform them that this little Black girl from the West End could be any of your children in the classroom. And if you don't handle these children with care, you could disrupt their lives. And my life was almost disrupted in the third grade because my little history, Jefferson County Public Schools was integrated the year my mother went into high school. She dropped out, had me. So by the time I'm in third grade, my third grade teacher had only been exposed to Black children for 8 years. I'm 8, right? So she tried to put me in special ed. The very next year, I had a 4th grade teacher who saw me and educated me. And I'm here today because of that. That's how, Black lives disrupted can affect a person. If I had not been cared for in the 4th grade, I wouldn't be here today. That's how powerful that is, right? So I want to remind people that this work is about saving the lives of children as well, right? As we dive into what Dr. Yu was just talking about, this kind of fictional reality that we're all fighting against, this truly affects Black, brown, Asian bodies and minds. So this is very real work. Next slide. So my guiding principles are children should feel more like themselves after we teach them than before. So you have to know something about the children. You have to view their history and their citizenship on the planet as valuable. We all have the same address. I'm a science teacher. Our address is Third Rock from the Sun. This is our only home. So when you tell me that sitting in the living room is foreign because you think you own the planet, you own the whole house, and we all live up in here. Houston, we have a problem. We all live in this house. When you look at the choices before you through both yours and your students' eyes, which are spiritually the same eyes, then you have become a whole teacher. You cannot teach fairness without being fair. You cannot teach generosity without being generous, right? Our values do not have to be identical, but they have to be compatible. So I don't care what you feel about LGBTQ people. I don't care what you feel like about Black people or whatever. But if your values disrupt my existence, we have a problem. To succeed as a teacher, you have to acknowledge that there is a powerful mind, imagination, and spirit present in that child that should be honored instead of taken away. These are the guiding principles of a true teacher. If you go into the classroom and you don't have these principles, I want every parent in that community to get you fired, because I'm not going to give you my kids and you're trying to disrupt them. Next slide. Here's some terms. Next slide. Ethnic identity, the cultural factors such as nationality, tribal affiliation, religion, language, and traditions of a particular group. Here's a serious one, power. Because what we've been experiencing is power over, power to disrupt, power to oppress. But there's a different definition of power that we should embody. The ability to affect change and be the ultimate knower of yourself. We have to model what this looks like for students and humbly get out of their way so that they can take care of us when we're old. Because if we keep abusing the kids, they're going to abuse us when we can't take care of ourselves. And I don't know about anybody else, but I've not yet, outside of European cultural tradition, I have not yet read anything about anybody else's culture where you don't take care of the kids so that they can take care of you. We're not young for all of our lives. So when you have power, that means you're cultivating someone else without stripping them of their own power. You're actually empowering them, cultivating power within them. And then culture are ways of being and knowing that are rooted in ancestral wisdom, problem solving, personal and community enactment, ways of psychologically, spiritually, emotionally tying back to reflect, relate, and plan in the now and in the future. We tie back to move forward. It's not about holidays and dances. These are ancestral ways of connecting to problem solving that, as a biologist, I have to tell you, is over 350,000 years old. I mostly tell people I'm African American because 36,000 years of imprinting can't be wrong. I'm here. My ancestors survived the great atrocity. So I'm going to tie back to whatever it is that they gave me so I can survive this craziness called 2021. That's culture. Next slide. So when we think about funds of knowledge, I want us to think about that in that context, but it's defined in the literature as knowledge and skills among families that have developed throughout history and by being immersed in a specific culture. Next slide. So there's a video, and I'm not going to show it because we don't have that kind of time, but it's the European Asset or Privilege Walk, and it's a bunch of college students of different ethnicities. And he starts, everybody's familiar with it. He starts asking questions, and all the white kids go in the front, all the middle-class white kids, because the poor white kids and the women are in the back. And I looked at this video and I said to myself, why, if people get to a certain affluency because of European assets, why are all those people of color and those Black kids still there? So I started thinking about this deeply, and I said, well, as an African American, I have assets. And some of them are, I created an African American asset walk. Some of them are like, if the adults in your neighborhood practice collective child rearing and safety, that is, your neighborhood, the next door neighbor could discipline, feed, and care for you in the place of parents until they got home. That's an asset. if topics about race, class, slavery, gender, sexual preferences, economics, and other complex topics were openly discussed in your household, and problem solving for those issues was passed down culturally from generation to generation, that's an African American asset. Or if gender roles were blurred to make it easier to integrate work schedules, child rearing, household duties, these things are African American assets. This makes sense to me why, even in an oppressive system, all these cultural, ethnic people have these assets that allow them to still show up, even when oppressed. If you don't know anything about these things, you're going to be part of the problem. You're going to continue the oppression. But when you bring these assets to bear in a classroom, you then get to the business of empowering children. Next slide. So when I think about how that little Black girl had enough resilience in her to make it through and survive third grade, to go on in her education, what are the cultural assets that I tied into? And it's values of equity and freedom and education, a history of positive social change, community unity, and spiritual beliefs rooted in identity and self-determination is extremely important to African-American children and families. So what does this look like in the class? It's going to look like code switching. It's going to look like bonding. It's going to look like bridging, right? These are some of the social aspects of what African-American children do in the classroom to survive. And if given an opportunity, they can thrive and live and be the creative geniuses that they are. One of the biggest exports in America is African-American culture. Our creativity is money. So if you give us an opportunity, we are a bankable, people, right? They brought us over here for that. So next slide. So when you're planning your lessons and units and when you're caring for other people's children, some of the instructional approaches include creative analogies, encourage whole class and small group discussions, form collaborative groups and not competitive groups, right? Encourage students to help one another, ask three then me. Curriculum framing, link community issues and students' lived experiences with the content. Encourage the applications of students' cultural knowledge to understand school knowledge, bridge those two things. Provide direction for children to learn from and with their peers, provide collaborative environments. Now, mind you, all of this will help all kids, but specifically because I've been Black all my life, these things are rooted in, the thing that allowed me to survive. Next slide. I'm a student of Etta Hollins, so I can't leave you without homework, right? So focus inquiry is a method of teacher inquiry, teacher practice, where you dive into the literature like we've all been sharing, but you ask questions and you form groups and you look at some of the challenges and you apply that knowledge to the challenges that you have in your classroom. That's focus inquiry. You tie back and ask a more knowledgeable other, your professors or teachers who get high outcomes from kids. How do they do these things? And a lot of the knowledge about African-American socialization in schools actually comes from African and African-American scholars like the spirit of intimacy and spoken soul, our language, right? The roots of our language and the integration of African rules of language with being forced to speak English. Racial and ethnic identities in schools. It's an oldie but goodie. I tie back to it all the time. African-centered pedagogy. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Peter Morrell before he passed, one of the ancestors, and this book is truly a gift. And then Catching Sense, the tie between African culture and African-American culture. There's things about what we do that are still African that African-Americans are unconscious that we still do. Next slide. And guided practice, that is putting these things in practice. So use the intersectionality has been a theme all throughout this discussion today. Recognize the combinations of people's identities and how, you know, in different contexts, people move about in different ways. So that's a very important. Plan to get to know your students and earn their trust. Learn them and earn their trust. Um, Dr. Hollins has a RIQ process in her Culture and School Learning book. I teach my candidates, you need to know a strength, a talent, and a challenge of all your students, the big three. If you don't get to know your students, they're gonna know that you don't know what you're doing. Plan lessons where students' assets influence and inform what example scenarios, vignette, problems, stories, analogies are used to introduce, teach, and assess a lesson, right? That's all for me. I'm gonna give it back to Dr. Branch.
Thank you so much. Dr. Linton, as well as all of my colleagues here, you have absolutely been terrific this afternoon. And I have questions for you from our audience. The first one goes to Dr. Sleeter. You urge teacher education programs to systematically change so that they go beyond adding a course or a series of learning experiences. You argue that otherwise new teachers replicate practices that don't address the ethnic identities of their students. So given the CTC requirements and the limit on how many credits we can require teacher candidates to complete, what suggestions do you have?
You know, I've worked with people on taking the standards and developing a program and then trying to map it against the standards. But sometimes I really feel like the standards placed on teacher education get in the way. An example is the program that I worked with in California. I and some colleagues tried to build community-based learning as a part of that program. And the way, at least the way our other colleagues were interpreting the standards, we could never get consensus on space for that essential learning experience within the program. So having said that, I think that it's possible to do quite a bit, as Caro in her presentation showed what was happening, what she and her colleagues are doing at Fullerton. I think that's actually a terrific example of reconstructing a program in a way that speaks to the standards. But I think if there's anybody at CTC here, what I would say to CTC is that would be most helpful would be to get together a bunch of teacher educators who are doing this work, who can plan a program that actually really does the job and makes sense, and then have a dialogue with CTC about how the state can be supportive of that and what things the state does end up being barriers thrown into the process. I think the state actually can be supportive, but in mandating down to the details, what all goes into a program, it ends up being somebody's version of what a program should look like that ends up just short-circuiting the creative and important work that other people have.
Thank you so much. Dr. Valdez, the next question comes to you, and I'm particularly interested in the answer to this question. Are there concerns about having these conversations that you suggest with small children?
Yeah, that's often the question I get every single semester from my teacher candidates or from outsiders when I present on this. And my response is, if they're old enough to experience racism, they're old enough to talk about it. If they're old enough to experience homophobia, any of these systems of oppression, they're old enough to talk about it. And then secondly, they already observe this. Children are very, very observant, right? They know what's going on. They overhear adults in their life. They overhear the news. And so they know that this is happening, but they're just not allowed to talk about it, right? And so then it turns into these false narratives of what they think is happening without like a critical support to help them reflect on it. And to be honest, I always say that this is the age where it's easiest to have these conversations because they're open. They haven't developed apathy yet, right?
Yes.
You bring up issues of injustice with children and they're quick to say, well, that's not fair. Well, you're right, that's not fair. So what would be fair, right? And they're able to brainstorm in ways that I would argue older folks aren't, because they're much quicker to be like, well, but that's just not gonna happen, right? They're able to use that imagination to reimagine a different world.
Thank you. Thank you. It just makes such good sense. Dr. Adelabu, a question that came for you was, how can educators be intentional about affirming the ethnic identity of students who are enrolled in a school community that doesn't prioritize ethnic identity in the curriculum? You are speaking to most of the people in the country right now.
Yes, I would say that, the time is now. So we cannot wait for systems to catch up. And so it really is important for us as educators to find allies within our school system, allies within our buildings, allies within our communities, and bring those allies in to really help us to engage in the work. I also think it's important for us to use our voice to sit on hiring committees so that we know, we have some say in who's coming into our school community, and we have folks who are coming in who are woke, folks who are coming in with a level of consciousness that can really support the needs of our students. And so be sure that we are in positions where our voices are heard, and to continue with the work and to evaluate, to assess what we do, and to continue to showcase that, because we know, based on the research, that affirming, sustaining the ethnic identity of students, that we see the positive outcomes. And so we cannot wait for systems to catch up with us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Dr. Yu, a question that came for you beyond the tears was, can you expand on the psychological and educational implications of the model minority myth?
Sure. There's this pervasive popular stereotype that Asian Americans are really hardworking, good at math, good at science, and that their success in this country is based off that hard work and individual efforts and unrestricted mobility. More importantly, that sort of idea is oftentimes used to compare against other Black and Brown communities to suggest that it is through this hard work and belief in the American dream is the reason why they're successful, and that these other groups are not living up to the myth of the meritocracy and the bootstrap uplifting. And so when I think about that and how that minimizes not only Asian Americans' experience of racism, as well as minimizing the hard work of Black and Brown folks, as well as minimizing the larger structure in the history of white supremacy, we see that the term is not actually a success term. It is not a term that actually Asian Americans use. It was a term that was coined in the civil rights movement by a white sociologist by the name of William Peterson, who used Asian Americans at the time to be pitted up against other, again, Black and Brown communities during the civil rights movement to minimize their efforts. It is not only there, but actually dates back even further after the Civil War, where after freed Blacks, Chinese coolies from the West Coast were brought into the Southern plantations to be pitted against, once again, demonizing Black folks at the same time, arguing that Asians were a cheaper, a more subservient hard worker, that were more quiet and meek. The same types of stereotypes that are used today to justify and rationalize the exploitation of labor back then. So this stereotype still plays out not only in terms of how we don't address racism in Asian Americans in the K through 12, but literally in the narratives in which we see the violence happening today, right? As we think about the Stop AAPI, there's a hyper and narrow myopic focus on the perpetrators, whether they're Black, that are and why are they beating up on hardworking individuals, without the context of the larger history of the modern stereotype, which is to operate and justify and rationalize white supremacy. full stop.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Dr. Linton, what do you mean by the community, unity, and spiritual beliefs root identity?
So what I mean by that, an example of that is, as a new teacher, I was hired at a predominantly Mexican-American school in San Diego, right? I was 3 US exits from the US border. So my duty, I felt as a new teacher, was to become a part of that community as an African American living in the cultural historical space of the children and the families I was serving. I had a duty to learn as much as I could about the language and socialization and history of that community in order to care for those people's children. So when I'm in that space, I have to understand what grounds their identity so I don't disrupt it, so that I don't project my African American Southernness onto the children. I was curious about them. I wanted them to help me because in that they were learning biology, I became an emergent bilingual in their class, right? I became a emerging Spanish learner for them. I became a student of ethnic studies for that community, right? So what I mean by community and unity and spirituality root identity, that means I don't make assumptions that my job as a teacher is to assimilate them into a society that is oppressive to them. My job is to empower them based on the knowledge that I'm learning about them so that I can teach them biology in a way that makes them feel more like themselves. So that meant I had to learn about Aztec culture, Mayan culture, Incan culture, indigenous culture. I had to understand as a science teacher, there's science contributions throughout history. So when they were feeling discouraged when they were learning biology, I could use their own history to empower them and say, if your ancestors could come up with the concept of the calendar and zero, you can learn about mitochondria. It's not foreign to you. So I could use those analogies and examples to uplift and encourage a people, right, who do not look like me. And I had to be very aware of my cultural identity, my language. I had to know where I stopped and where my students began, right? So that I wouldn't disrupt them. And if I felt that, I had an inkling, like I was going through some trauma when I became a credentialed teacher. And I am very equipped to say this. A lot of people say, don't say that. But I got a therapist when I became a new teacher so that I wouldn't screw up other people's kids. I was very consciously aware that I had to work out some things about myself before I entered into that classroom. So if you've got to go and do some work, but don't work out your shit, excuse my language, on people's children. That's not your place. That's what I mean.
Thank you, Dr. Linton. Thank you all for keeping it real. One question came to me: should the group that teaches ethnic identity exploration in education be culturally diverse, or should this kind of teaching be reserved for teachers of color? The reality in the United States of America is that most of the teachers in public school classrooms are white women. So if we were to leave this work for teachers of color, then scores, hundreds, thousands, millions of children would not begin to know who they are in public school, would not be affirmed by their teachers in public school. They would not begin to value schooling and their ethnicity at the same time, which is certainly possible when teachers affirm who they are. I could go on, and there are a few more questions. We've got 4 minutes. There's another question here for Dr. Valdez. Are there, can what you propose be expanded department-wide?
Yeah, so when we actually met last summer and read these articles and came up with our framework and curricular alignment, that we asked that question, and my response was no. And the reason being, we don't have the expertise. You can't just hand this to people and say, yeah, go duplicate it. If you don't have that content knowledge, if you don't have that critical reflection, because otherwise having these conversations can go real south. It can traumatize the people of color in the room, right? It could perpetuate white supremacy. So no, at this moment, no. I would like to think that should we acquire more faculty with that expertise, we could expand, right? We're looking at, we just brought in 2 new folks that do have that expertise. They're gonna start next fall, where possibly we could add 2 cohorts that embed this, right? Because we have that expertise, but it's not something that can be duplicate. You can't just hand people, as much as we would love to, like, yes, let me show you some examples, but that's to get your critical juices flowing so that you can begin to do this independently and interrogate the curriculum and your pedagogical practices. It's not to be duplicated exactly. The same way as teaching ethnic studies, I wouldn't teach the same thing that I had when I was in downtown LA to what I had in South LA. It was a different community, different demographics, right? Different needs. And so understanding that it's not like a cookie cutter, one size fit all, you really have to have that expertise to be able to tailor it to the community.
Thank you. That is precisely why I advocate that we begin ethnic identity exploration in teacher education programs so that pre-service teachers can begin to immerse themselves in this work and be equipped, or begin the process of being equipped to do what you're talking about. My clock says 11:58. Is that right, Donnie? Dr. Adelabu, there's another question for you. As an educator, I value the importance of affirming the ethnic identity of students. How might educators affirm students in subjects like math and science? And you've got less than a minute.
And I would say that Professor Linton is probably better at responding to this, but I think like really looking at the curriculum that's out there based on culturally relevant, culturally sustaining approaches to math and science. And so there are plenty of them that are out there. And I would just encourage folks to look for those. And then I would also add that at Boston University this summer, we are actually hosting an institute on education for equity and democracy. And so I don't have the link, but hopefully folks will look for it. And then we're also initiating a master's degree in equity and democracy. And we're including many of the concepts that we have discussed today.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you again from the very bottom of my heart for all that you have given today to this topic. I want to encourage all of our attendees as well to think about action steps that you can take based upon what you've learned today. I know that all of my colleagues here would be delighted to hear from you. Please contact us, ask us how we can help you to do a better job of saving the lives of children by affirming their ethnic identity. Thank you so much.